Hello everyone. The summer days are probably for many of you days of vacations. I see it also through the algorithm. I know that it's the first wave of vacation, mass vacation. You can observe it even from these indicators. I frankly don't know when, and whether I will go on vacation at some point in the last years for non-obvious reasons, not actually because of COVID, but for others. I have objectively stopped, and I'm a person that actually was always habituated to travel a lot, right? Not just often, but a lot, properly in traveling for the sake of staying one place or multiple places in a row to dig in also our historical information. I have fortunately very pleasant memories. But at some point, I look at this, and I don't do it for Schwerpunkt, of course, to stay here. It just happens, and I realize that, however, there is a broader point for which I am working at this stuff, as well as the broader one that I make for I'm writing at this point mostly articles. As you know, we have stopped making channel updates, so there is some important stuff that we will have to start addressing probably from next month, hopefully, as well, because you may never know what's going on at a time. And addressing a bit, taking back the reins of what Schwerpunkt has meant to be. And I've been working so hard also in part, among the other things, and again, this was not the cause, but it was rather a consequence and an unavoidable one, to just make as much algorithmic videos, let's say, as possible, right? This saturation strategy that has paid off importantly because subscribers have kept increasing in spite, as you know, from last year, because some of you don't even know, right? I have at this point almost only actually 1,000 subscribers compared to last year's, because things went down. As you know, ever since I began to re-upload the older videos and so on, that all the algorithmic base was gone for a while. So I decided to maintain this regime of intensive history at some point. That is extenuating. That's why also I break with part of this videos, because in part, again, there are less people listening at this point, so I can afford to do that. But the idea is that we will probably come back at some regular regime that would include probably the older one of 3 videos, one of which would be about von Clausewitz, the other being, say, from 2 cycles of history and military history content that I, normally is the one that you see I still make videos on, and I resumed particularly from a military point of view recently, and there's really a lot to do. Easily, one thing here that is certain is that I will never finish the topics. Right, there is no embarrassment of sort for deciding what topics, what topic I have to choose. If not for the fact that they are infinite, that I can make infinite videos. Were I to live forever in my, heroic transfiguration to an immortal deity, but let's say this is perhaps unlikely. The point being that, however, it's just about the time that I want to dedicate to it, and so in the last year, lots of things, say last 2 years, lots of things happened, and I had to regulate this regime in a different way because I didn't feel particularly well. Again, not because of this. As you know, I'm not really, I don't sound like a person who, gets tired. You hear me every day, I'm like a machine. People think that I work like that, right? That I'm square, cold, etc. And I like doing this. The reason why I felt unwell, perhaps we will talk about it at some point to explain also what went on with the channel, is it has completely nothing to do with that. It's nothing to do with my work either, not even with my family. It's rather, as you know, for one specific sentimental reason, and that really brought me down consistently. And I must say that Schwerpunkt really helped me, because it was the only thing that I kept doing consistently throughout this time. I think I surpassed the most difficult moment, but let's say I've had this moment of slowing down, and there are other factors that contributed, however, to modify my mindset recently, that always pass through history, right? In part, it has to do with the fact that I finished the doctorate and began to do other things, mostly articles, but still something, again, that was more designed for another, let's say, another horizon compared to the one that I reached with, last year with my thesis. It has to do with the fact that I lost, let's say, a group, part of some interaction that I had with some military history amateurs, let's say, that gravitated around a scholarly figure that unfortunately passed away as suddenly as, in fact, dramatically, prematurely, for also what it could have given to Schwerpunkt, in the sense that I was held informed by that, was this heartbreak I was talking about before. There was in general the fact that through the same history and through the same topics that I chose to at some point also distract myself from, after all this load that came all at a time with the end of the doctorate, was a very fast-paced, right? And I really worked a lot. And I remember last year, in fact, I began to make also shorter videos, because, I mean, it's not that you didn't like that, but it was in part also because I got ever more specific, in a sense, because I could make shorter videos. The day I commented on the Filmkrieg, I didn't need to prepare the pictures especially, so it was easy to manage it at some point. This year instead, I came back with this very long videos, and I resumed also a great part of the interest in properly seeking a more comprehensive explanation historically, and you see that I put a lot of effort of some kind. So all these factors blended together, so certain topics that I specifically learned, in part even from scratch, relatively to universality and tradition and view of history, has somewhat, and probably you noticed that, somewhat radicalized the view that I had, right? I say radicalized because I like to, use this hyperbole to, to provoke you, and at the same time, I'm very wary that what I do here is assuming the trait of an ever more not necessarily politically oriented per se, because this is, I guess, the point even of this video, that speaking of conservatism, it's not a matter of, of an alternative or a specific, let's say, a specifically recognizable group, or anything necessarily that you have seen so far that you think maybe you are, even as a conservative, or but you think that conservatives are as liberals. It's something else entirely that would deserve much more than a video like this to be fully explained. And to make the long story short, this is something that occurred also on a much longer term than last year or whatever, when I began to make clarity into not, being probably more fully dedicated to topics that I wanted to examine myself. I finally read literature, narrative, after years that I just read history books. And again, so this is kind of a new phase of my life in which I also hope to give a bit more of push to Schwerpunkt that so far has kept always growing. And especially in the last couple of 2-3 months, let's say, has shown to be able to attract essentially the same amount of subscribers that it was able doing last year, in spite of a lower traffic. So whenever this thing will again will essentially synchronize with the algorithm kicking in and properly making everything grow again at the same rate, I think that we can easily turn Schwerpunkt into something more than just say, just maybe it's not the right adverb, but let's say a YouTube channel that I also see through the stats, through the comments, that you after all cope with a bit like surely as an alternative, right? And it seems, I must say, as far as I hear, that there is normally people who talk about military history on YouTube are conservative leaning, right? But at the same time, I have all my idea that also probably derives from the fact that I don't listen to any YouTube channel, that there is a great, a lack of broader frame these topics, these issues, that I began to give to the channel, especially ever since I began to comment on the Formkriege, which we will have to finish because we had surpassed 2/3, and it doesn't end there, because I have in store lots of videos about von Clausewitz, about properly the meaning of this channel that many followers, also some of the old ones, do not seem to have properly focused. I have lots, I have a few people actually commenting. There are always the same people during the years, usually. Sometimes maybe they stop appearing, etc. But I realized that, I am used as a point of reference also by many overt conservatives that come here to probably not much affirming themselves, but trying to be validated, because they think that I'm, as a conservative, I would just wink at them if they self-style themselves like this and that. First of all, are very funny sometimes, because they even quarrel with each other, right? You're supposed to have a unity of knowledge and of values and intents, and everybody says different things, and that immediately tells you that there is something wrong. And so whatever your definition of conservatism, that we'll not attempt to do now in a thorough sense, and it shouldn't be, in fact, even an hypothesis of itself, is pretty vague, as much as what also liberalism and a lot of other things have become nowadays. And part of this stems naturally from the same historical problem. It's obvious that when you come to listen here on a channel of an actual historian who talks about history, you expect probably the historian to say something like, history is the most important thing ever, like, because you think that if you talk to an engineer, he will tell you the same, that engineering is the most important thing ever. I don't know, I've never heard an engineer talking like that. Probably, there is this kind of corporative mentality for which you, of course, whatever you study, whatever you think you're doing is the best one. I have personally developed my historical interest in an existential sense, but you would be surprised I'm not that person who says, oh my god, I don't know, I'm a medievalist, so everything I do is about the Middle Ages. Oh my god, the Middle Ages as such, I love them, it's my favorite period, whatever. I don't even reason like this. I don't care, right? You would be surprised of the fact that I don't give a damn about it at all. Not just because the Middle Ages, as I often say, never existed, but exactly because it's a box in which I would confine myself if I thought that my life ended there, or my vision of the world ended there, my mind stopped to that. And this is a problem that I see happening, just like the guys quarreling about, the allegedly deep, conservative values that they all have, but they all disagree on. And so, you that's where you understand there is a problem. And in fact, this is the point that I just know that talking about history would have more conservative subscribers, as much as the fact that, especially considering certain topics that are definitely, if one were to follow the political compass today, somewhat right-wing, or at least, say, stimulating some ideas mostly from that background and creating instead problems from the opposite side, I would receive lots of such alleged, again, conservatives or even more, right? The alt-righters, the right-wingers are always acting covertly, and not so much, let's say, but nobody comes here and says, I'm an old writer, so here I feel free to. That they're always scared. That immediately tells you that also what the alleged, even in their kind of values and straightforwardness and openness should be about. Of course, I wouldn't tolerate them on the channel, as I don't tolerate communism, as I don't tolerate, in fact, the same nationalism that again are all collectivistic ideology. Nationalism, socialism, basically fit in the same box of collectivism, but not just that. And this already is a source of enormous difficulty, probably of mental difficulty and understanding. It's true that I haven't fully explained the thing. I've come out with this stuff just recently, in a sense. So it's my responsibility to be understood here. So I will not make you accountable if you misunderstand. But if I make a point, also you may want to see, even with a simple explanation, what I'm actually referring to. I also don't have a clear understanding of how politically my audience is partitioned, let's say. Is composed. Like partition doesn't sound right. It sounds more like Poland being partitioned in the late 18th century. What I mean is that, of course, there is a division of some sort, and when it gets to politics, it's ever more, so-called people say bipolar, but it's an illusion, right? Even the terminology of it should allude at something else, not at this specific. There is no such thing. Like the first mistake is considering that there are two positions that can be different and equal in grounds and in nature. This doesn't mean that they shouldn't exist, or that only one should exist, or that the world would function just with one. The point is realizing the intrinsic quality of it. And today's topic starts from a reflection that I was making about my increasing intolerance and harshness and lack of compromise, which I think is, in essence, the definition of conservatism. I mean, this is, say, if not properly right and left as harshness and leniency, respectively. I do think it really gets down to that. It's not about specific ideologies, say, political doctrines, say, more specifically, or who knows what. Even religion is an important issue that this channel also has to explain thoroughly, at least, what position I lay, what I simply think about. And this thing does take time. As I was saying before, history, I think, made it, right? The fact that for years, for more than a decade, I've been basically learning history every day, doing pretty much nothing else, right? I do physical activity, I traveled, I do other things, I play music, things, but let's say fundamentally, being not, let's say, okay, it's today's duty, right? It's today's pleasure, it's today's raison d'être, in a sense. It's the idea of, whatever you want to do. When I remember I was at university, I had to prepare for the exams, but when I stopped, what did you do? It was always something historically themed in a way or another. It was passing from a book to another, or even just looking at things or playing in contexts that were historically based, and that always searched for not mere entertainment, but something constructive and positively applicable to a beneficial sense through history in itself. And the point of this video is really simple, right? I will just illustrate what fundamentally history made to me over the years, by meaning with history, of course, the activity of research that I actually led. So something, and making history myself, because as you know, I arrived to the point where I'm writing the same history that other people are basically studying on. So at this point, I'm beyond, and I've reached a level in which I would be expected to not just being able, again, to write an article, whatever, but let's say also to have a broader judgment, which again in my life is becoming an issue, because it turns out that I scare people when I talk to them. I think it's their problem, not mine, because of standards, right? The idea I see constantly in the average person is that, and this somewhat increased because at least my milieu habituated me to the concept and to the evidence and to something that shouldn't not even been explained, that the less capable you are, the worse you're gonna be in life. I mean, even if this was never properly stated, like you think I come from a background in which I wasn't, enforce this terrible ethics of work or whatever. Absolutely not, right? I was mostly let free to do what I wanted. Of course, I had to respect some rules that were simply, I had to study, I had to do well in school. I didn't have to excel, but I had to just do that. And eventually I would have had to work and succeeding, hopefully, and getting somewhere, achieving some important result, then hopefully having a family of my own and all these things. And it was very clear, right? It was not presented to me as an imposition. It was presented to me like, in fact, as a conservative, as a believer in tradition and universality. It was self-evident to me since the beginning. Again, I lived in an environment in which this was normal. It didn't even take to be explained, right? The entire system of values was about this. And it wasn't enforced. It was simply, explained in a reasonable, logic, clear, lucid way, and it made a lot of sense. And it turns out that in life, every time something goes wrong is because objectively you go astray from this line, this direction. And even though things can happen, because bad things do happen, right? There is practically no other way to improve the situation just by whining on yourself and blaming something else outside of you as a superstition that prevented you and just makes you cooking in self-hatred at the end of the day, because you think it was the other person's fault, but you are actually denying that it was your fault, one way or another. And these concepts are very difficult to accept nowadays by, I think, the majority of people that I talk to. It's true that sometimes I talk from people from, say, backgrounds from which I would expect, let's say, I normally expect not to, not to hear something similar to what I was habituated. Not much because of a matter of, of social extraction, whatever, which also probably it has to do with that, but also probably from the cultural and country background. I tested this, and as a conservative, and as I was saying before, nationalism is an anti-traditional and a deeply anti-European ideology, which is based on the concept of empire and universality and tradition. It has absolutely nothing to do with any form of collectivism. That is a form of denial of individual value in exchange for thinking that you're special just for doing nothing. And so this is the root of it in many ways. But because, of course, I spotted that the only people I get along with are the ones that came from my same milieu. That was definitely kind of an upper middle, I hate the word class, but that conventionally, Marxism has unfortunately infiltrated in our language, so just to be clear, for the sake of simplicity, are the ones that are also in other contexts that can be countries entirely, are good people, right? And that instead, if there is something culturally in the cultural background that has undermined that sense of respect towards merit, personal values, individual strength, responsibility, capacity, in any sense to achieve positively, I meet this with this barrier. As I made these examples in the past, that I meet, for example, with women and say, but you speak too complexly, because I use a language that could be the same language that I'm using with you right now. And the thing that impressed me is not to say, oh my God, this guy, allegedly, at least is smarter than me, that this is what they should think, right? Instead of feeling, okay, maybe that's a positive thing, I really want this over a moron, the first thing I say, I will tell him, I feel intimidated by the fact that he uses a more complex, language system than mine. And so immediately, from this mindset, you realize that these women, for example, are paranoid for something that they have probably never conceived in their cultural horizon, right? It's obvious that especially the post-socialist world has been completely deprived of this sense that things should be better, because the concept properly of comparison has been eliminated at the root by socialistic ideologism, because that's what it all aims at, right? And the same, of course, happens with nationalism, the incapacity of substantiating the differences, the forms, right? Being incapable of realizing that, I don't know, before being fascinated with, I don't know, Korean anime and culture just because, you haven't studied anything else in your life. You should maybe study the history of your own country and continent to actually even give a dimension to the same world where you live and to the one that you are analyzing. This thing has been completely stripped from culture, right? In the past, this was completely normal. People knew each other. People knew other countries. They knew other traditions. They went there. They studied the languages. They studied the history. They studied the culture. Traditional European elite, Western elite, was principally a humanistic elite. Just look at what conservatism has become now, right? You have to be an economist, or you have to be anything that is not humanist, right? Because humanism doesn't make you earn money, right? If you think this, basically means that you have completely eliminated what conservatism tradition substantiates itself, that is moral force, spirituality. The fact that if you understand the historical value of a place, you can make a shit ton of money just by telling its own history, which is also partly why I'm here as Schwerpunkt, for example. I'm perfectly aware that those people who call themselves conservatives or think that they, by taking certain political positions that are actually defending Europe or the West or whatever they think or they imagine on a completely fantasy base, that actually means do not know anything, but I mean even the slightest minimally relevant historical notion about the very place where they live. And this happens every single day. This is not just about the average person that, of course, doesn't have any satisfactory historical education for a mature, human being and citizen. But we're talking even about the specialists that, as you know, are driving away and also fuel the impression from the other side that such things like history or humanities are useless, because objectively, yes, those who mostly explain them are incompetent. And the reason why I touched today's topic is that I think at this point in my life to have arrived to a point in my to a level of understanding, I would like to say, but then you say, oh my God, the guy thinks he's so intelligent, I think he's still above. No, it's really, I'm on a path, you see, as if you think a path of self-development, of course. And if you think that the truth exists, right, so this has nothing to do with you owning your own, or which basically denies the very concept, or that you can even own the truth, but that still you can orient yourself and navigate yourself to reality using that compass, and so improving along the way. I do think that consistently, after all this time of learning, that there is a broader pattern in what happens when you study history over a long period of time, and why specifically history does tend to make you more conservative, and trying to explain what that actually means. And I do realize that my personal path is pretty weird, has always been considered as such by basically any environment I've visited, starting from the same school, university. I was like, the conservative person who, seemed, isolated and thought strange things that to me said were the most normal ones, and I wouldn't understand why the others wouldn't understand the same thing. And I'm not simply talking about, I was never discriminated against because I was conservative per se, that were always conservatives that I knew. Everything was equally split, and I don't come, fortunately, from a place where the clash between ideologies has taken the dramatic and vicious proportions of some other countries, but this may not even necessarily be a positive thing per se. But let's say I have measured at this point also on people that I know over a long period of time, and also, again, this more recent individuals, that there is a category within which you fit that tells a lot about what your life fundamentally has been about in relation with knowledge, with truth, with awareness, understanding of the world, which is not subjective, right? That is subjective, of course, in the measure in which we all have a different experience, but the fact that it's all different doesn't mean that it's entirely different. And the simple reason why you should think there is a truth, if anything, is because we are all human beings. So if you deny that, things start getting really undefendable, also on the grounds that allegedly liberals own and that actually don't, and that's the problem with them mostly. But also, it shows you why history and how history makes the thing, and why it's so crucial and relevant, and how, insisting definitely on the path of understanding it better by learning it and working on it seriously, it really can improve your situation as properly as a human being, and it should be so. And there is this is not just a matter of empirical, let's say, again, kind of subjective experience. This is properly drawing from history, not just that alchemic knowledge that would make you more intelligent. It's properly seeing what happens also and happened to other humans in the past, and why a certain past that also as conservatives we try to defend in a traditional sense made sense, and the changes that occurred are not unblocked just, say in the causes, unblocked just positive or negative, right? We live normally in within a historical narrative that very often the same conservatives fall in blindly, thinking, I don't know, that, for example, the Middle Ages were a dark age, or that, everything started going better from the Enlightenment onwards, right? These attitudes, these mental forms reveal a grave, not just under education, but also cultural inferiority, which is shared, unfortunately, by basically all the world at these levels, because also everything goes by reflection of everything that the West has done. So all the mistakes that we make are the others just receive passively, because they don't have any mean to have anything to oppose at that point either. And this has to do, of course, with the fact that Western civilization was at least the one that made it in a more comprehensive sense, and the others have just to accept that this is historically a matter of fact, not really a matter of opinion. Already, making these points is practically impossible, again, if you don't have a broader historical perspective, because you will think that broader historical perspective is just a mean to say, I want to, to fool you that I'm right and you're wrong, and and that of course makes leverage on the radical paranoia that basically increases the more you distance yourself from the West as a existential identity mode, culturally speaking. And the enormous problem is that we seem to have lost control on the means of education. So not just because of the Marxists and so on, but because, again, it's a global, universal phenomenon that was meant to happen, because all traditional cultures, here I'm not talking about the West as if it was, unique in the form of Europeanness or everything that stemmed from it, right? All traditional cultures all over the world were basically the same, and some kind of cultivated, that wisdom and began to build the world on the base of that. Some others lagged behind and paid for the consequences of what they couldn't harvest from the very intense work. In any case, this is yet another thing that we'll have to talk at some point, and this is to explain paradoxically that I'm not Western-centric, that the fact that I live within this world doesn't mean that I am blind to what is outside. And this is exactly the point of history, right? We don't live in a reality where we cannot know what the others were, right? And pretending that this is instead kind of the case, as liberals do, that pretending that since the world is diverse, you must accept that people have different views. Of course I accept them. And as the problem is that you don't accept that these views are one better and one worse than the other, right? And there is no doubt about that if you, again, believe in the truth. And for this reason, you perfectly know that there can't be any form of equality in an imperfect world. And as such, what you really mean is that you are stupidly, in the sense of stupor, from Latin, amazed by diversity, simply because you just stopped to acknowledging that there are different things from the ones you thought without even studying them, without even knowing what they actually mean, or even posing yourself the problem, and stopping there by saying to others that instead know them much better than you because they actually study other peoples and other cultures, which is something that you never do in your life, that, they're allegedly, narrow-minded because, that means that, you don't want to hear that there are other people that are more intelligent and educated and informed than you, right? It's discussing how how liberalism has somewhat monopolized this idea that being open-minded means just by the leftist agendas. If open-minded just by meaning, even psychologically speaking, simply means that you know so much that you can perfectly integrate the new information in the system of knowledge that you have to expand it further, and therefore building up a much broader and clearer understanding, and thus judgmental capacity that we know is higher in intelligent people. There is nothing to do about that. That incidentally are also the most educated ones, also contrarily to what some conservative thinks today, unfortunately, just because the level of education is disgusting, not because education has anything to do with that in absolute terms, because we're talking about knowledge and truth, right? So the ones that allegedly you're searching. If you feel an outcast as a conservative because you realize that you're just the average moron, well, you may want to fully acknowledge that, right, and try to do something about that, not pretending that since, somebody went to college and became just a Marxist ideologist and therefore, dumber than a bag of hamsters, fundamentally you are better simply than any person who had an education, because real education in the past was just for the elite. Only elite people were enormously, by the way, much more educated than basically anybody that we have now. And there was a specific reason why they were, right? Because they had to manage the world, because they needed to handle the burden of knowledge, which is in many traditional ways, as you perfectly know, actually the deal also of human condition in many ways. And this is exactly what doesn't happen today. How do you become conservative? By knowing more history. Well, first of all, we should start from this point that there is a mistake. It's a very common mistake that is done today that is about form and substance. In the past, I often said that people, say, living millennia ago, were more intelligent than us easily. Right, there was somebody, right, some snowflake probably, but that couldn't accept this very concept. I mean, of all the very controversial things I say, because I talk about politics, about war, violence, even not the justification of violence per se, but of course the fact that this is simply a military instrument subordinated to political action. And so you have, first of all, to acknowledge this, even to pretend that you're reasoning in a strategic fashion, which of course nobody does, right? To eliminate from your mind that since you are, conservative or liberal, whatever, this has anything to do with you understanding something like war or strategy, or it's not even because you don't know even the definition of them, but on a regular basis, because nobody habituates you even to define things and terms you use anymore, but because properly, in fact, it takes to know things, right? And there's this idea that today we're allegedly more intelligent than people in the past, or more capable. This is a typically modernistic and secularistic distortion of reality that doesn't match any evidence that we have, scientifically speaking, as a matter of fact. What it actually means is that we're just overloaded with information, right? And I say overloaded not because less information would be better, but it would be better maybe just if it had a form, right? In the past, up to 100 years ago or so, knowledge came in very specific forms, right, that have been legitimately criticized in the sense that they could naturally be expanded, but what actually happened is they were only destroyed. So what happened is also one of the great accomplishments, let's say, of the Marxist monopoly over universities, that of course we have increased knowledge because, you know, today we need much more knowledge than actual practical skills, right? The world that we own obliges us forcefully just to be like this. 100 years ago, people were more practically intelligent. Today, we are more theoretically intelligent, but this we are predisposed to be so. At least doesn't mean that even people in the past were less theoretically intelligent than us. The question is that there was an inversion of this knowledge, but so we are taught a lot, but the same educational systems do not care to provide you with the form through which that knowledge should be framed. So of course you can spend your entire life just knowing stuff, reading, watching, traveling, but if you don't give a form to that, if you don't make your brain making that extra step that will eventually increase the quality of understanding, so that also next time you will remember it and you will be able to look at the same knowledge differently and doing the same with other knowledge you will be acquiring, you fundamentally will not retain everything because you don't have the form that is to make sense of all that substance. Right, so no doubt we know more, but being capable or even understanding what to do with that is not the same thing, and it's completely skipped basically by any educational system that I know at this point, if not, of course, by some margin, but which is completely unsatisfactory. So the reason why in the past education was much more formally framed is because it was understood that that knowledge itself, when gathered in consistent form and quantity and quality, was showing a pattern, right? And this pattern was not a materialistic one, right? The main reason why the liberals have also injected this narrative that allegedly from the Enlightenment things began to improve is because they read history merely from a narrowly, hardly scientific way, which means that essentially if you cannot prove something mathematically or physically just through numbers, fundamentally in a quantitative sense, you cannot basically demonstrate anything, right? If you go to say normally to, you know, there is a reason why normally still today, and I can witness that math, physical faculties are much more leftistic lenient than actual humanistic ones, and this is particularly evident, for systems where actual, public education, which is not necessarily a negative thing, right? If you are habituated to that in your own country, doesn't mean that it's the other way in the others. Is actually, and it's always about the opportunity you're provided to actually learn, because it's always on you to learn. Right? And I must say I was provided with that, and I exploited that, I think, to an important extent. Not the one I would have liked, but it's my fault in case. And so there is this idea that even history should be judged that materialistically, deterministically, and relativistically by saying, since, from the Enlightenment, science skyrocketed, that's the only thing that matters. Right, as if the entire accomplishments of a civilization could be quantified in, in factors, in numbers, in measures, in something that you can apply basically, and yes, very usefully in in material ways, but that do not even try remotely to approach the most obviously and macroscopically, overwhelmingly more important dimension that lays in things like politics, like war, like society, right? It's not that the world will be saved by, a physical accomplishment per se, right? People have to know how to make use of that, and there is no physical answer to that because hard sciences evaluate, and of course there is an attempt sometimes of transposing their methods even in social sciences, and we know they don't work, or at least that these are absolute. At this point, there are theories that are also being manipulated completely. Just we see it in gender studies, right? That are completely altered, that have no scientific value whatsoever from any point of view. But it's the idea fundamentally that whatever is showed by history, just from a political point of view, how normally humans behave, since doesn't have a pattern that can be reduced to a mathematical equation, basically it's worthless, and you shouldn't even study that. And there is almost an hostility, an aggressiveness, an anger towards someone that tries to say, well, but if you basically study how things happen historically, you can have a pretty neat hierarchical sense of how things work, and you will find agreement when you reach that state of sensitivity and knowledge and understanding of that. This concept is skipped altogether, not just because, of course, the academic production goes in the other direction, where basically all you have to do now is ever less comprehensively understanding, is ever narrower, right? And so nobody needs to make the big work anymore, like it was normal up to a few generations ago, so that to understand everything and to train yourself in reasoning like that. But also because, in part, this was actively designed exactly to destroy that cultural dimension that could provide individuals with a political, military, or social understanding of reality, right? And that would convince them that radical moral subjectivism would become the banner of civilization. Again, as I always say, I never had anything against science. I think that if you pretend to study history without knowing physics, you basically can just do nothing in your life, because you will be completely useless, not just as a historian, but as an individual, right? And this should be sculpted in every person's mind, that in order to have a solid understanding of reality, we must study, in theory, everything, right? In practice, cultivating that realization that in order to become really useful for what you can acquire from intense studying, that you have to build a system that is tested over an overwhelming amount of evidence that cannot be just also this material one, just again a number, a degree, a coefficient, but essentially having been tempested with overwhelming human evidence, right? The Clausewitzian theory is exclusively founded on this. Basically, von Clausewitz says it's obvious that from a scientific point of view, there is no equation, there is no manual, and there is no way that will solve war, because it's beyond our scientific means. Nobody can do that. It's too complicated of a system. Should we basically abandon any hope to understand war? Hell no, because if you study actual war as it's been fought, so throughout history, you can start spotting some patterns that no physical equation will be able to calculate, but that the human brain is by default projected to understand, simply because humans are meant to understand other humans, and it does work. This concept, I wouldn't be surprised if by some scientific environments would be considered today as, a heresy or something that you cannot, must not teach because, it's dangerous, because it's fantasy, it's demonstrate this, prove it to you. these are, and of course, in order to prove it to them, you should teach them military history for 20 years and showing them how it actually works, and saying, well, yes, it's true. And I must say, I have plenty of evidence of that. I work with numbers myself. I wrote a pretty large chapter, something like 150 pages, just of numbers. I think I quoted tens of thousands of numbers just to show, as a preliminary introduction to my PhD thesis, that there was a trend that I could show from this tens of thousands of numbers shown by chronicles in the in the change in organic of armies in a specific early 14th century regional context, that surprise, by even methodologically using sources from chronicles, from backgrounds that had nothing to do with each other, altogether showed that freaking pattern, right? Both in absolute and in relative terms, also locally, complexively. And how is that an exception? How is that random, right? You see, if you say that there is no personal, if reality is subjective, there is no way to say whether one thing is objective or not. Well, face those numbers, and then you will tell me whether it's true or not. And those numbers are not a physical experiment in a laboratorium. Those numbers are chroniclers in the 14th century writing those numbers because they knew, and that study confirms that those numbers were true. And you can rely on them, and which you can calculate just as, science does empirically with experiments, because at the end of the day, that's basically the same thing, right? There's not a law that can be seen sculpted somewhere in the sky. It's still based on lots of experiments that give you always those figures, and therefore you can be reasonably certain that gravitational acceleration on the Earth is a certain coefficient. Well, why shouldn't this be, in a sense, of course, with much more approximation, but still with a very sound and hard political, military, and social awareness, a certain one in history? Yes, I am saying that if you see this even from a broader perspective, you basically become the only verifier of this, because first of all, in order to agree with me, I should show that chapter to you or to anyone who is skeptical, maybe skeptical about this, and to explain the method, to explain the evidence. And it wouldn't take even much, because simply by explaining what I do, most people would be convinced without even reading through all the tens of thousands of figures, right? And still, academically speaking, this is what should be done as well. But this very concept, and I've verified it, even humanistic faculties is very often say, no, this can't go. Because why? Because I've never seen it, because I've never seen anybody doing like that. And have you ever tried? Have you ever seen what happens? Can you read what I brought you, black and white, about this with all the actual references in a perfectly scientific method? This is what is being lost. It's the self-confidence in knowledge that we have lost. It's the same paranoia that I was talking about before. It's the defeatism, is giving up, is the idea that there is some other force that prevents you from knowing, while the entirety of humanity is, and its prosperity is based on knowledge, and all traditions were based on knowledge. This other bestiality that liberals brought into the equation, that allegedly, before the Enlightenment solved all human problems, according to these people, and before that, nothing existed, brought the idea that knowledge should be, as if, all the cultures before said, oh, knowledge, what is this thing? Oh, no, let's destroy everything, right? As if there hadn't been books, there hadn't been arts, there hadn't been academies, as people wouldn't do anything just to be educated, and as if knowledge wasn't so seriously taken that people wanted it to be checked and controlled and verified, because they knew how important its orthodoxy was, properly in the mathematical sense of the word. All traditional culture were based on this concept, right? Even the Indo-European hero is destroying the giant that is bigger than him, is just even more muscular than him, is more, but it's more stupid. And that's what ultimately brings to its demise, right? And there is something in the purity, in the rationality, in the clarity of not, which is in logic, in the same scientific method that today specifically is under attack. How many have you seen? Even in some universities, this is being taught now. Like logic, reason are allegedly tools of white supremacistic oppression. Right? We have arrived to this point that the sap, not just of Western civilization, but of humanity itself, is being denied. Naturally, those are radical Marxistic, lunacies that are done just for the sake of money, and has nothing to do even with the same ideologies, just people's greed, evil, stupidity, and ultimately ignorance, in fact, and much worse, frankly. If you understand what the consequences of that are for those same individuals. It's criminality. This is pure racism. It's satanism. It's complete lack of any trace of humanity, of any necessity of effort, of responsibility, of responsibility towards the. Imagine a world without reason, right? What it would turn like to be, and so this is awful because it's as if liberals, in great part now, were properly regressing. At least at some point, liberals were the ones who said, okay, we have to be harsh, but not so harsh. At this point is that, no, we shouldn't be harsh at all. That's completely wrong, right? This is basically the history of liberalism and what they can't even see themselves. I mean, it's that simple. You would say, how do you know these things? I studied history. And not just history as they would like you to study. No, I studied history scientifically, reasonably, right? So I didn't become a conservative because now I think, you see, I'm a bit racist, and, I just think that my country, should destroy others, or, who the fuck cares about, international cooperation, or, I think that poor can even simply die because I don't care about them, and what about handicaps as well? This is none of this, right? There is a broader idea that, of course, harshness is required to fix the world, especially in these times, in ways that are degenerating, are precipitating in a degenerative way, and that may even push very far, but not in the sense that normally conservatism is doing today. Conservatism today is basically just disintegrating tradition and universalism further. Conservatism has become incredibly soft and incredibly deprived of any effort, right? The idea of clarity and reason, etc., that are also so easy to handle once acquired, that spare you exactly from that even physical dimension that would limit you in so many ways, and that's why we developed the thing in the first place, has nothing to do with the main forms of conservatism that we're seeing today. They're basically ever more collectivistic in nature. They look at they're buying the same identity policy of the leftists. They're the same identical thing, and what they don't know is that not only they are doing like what the leftists do, is that they are doing what the leftists wanted them to do, because the entire point of Marxism was to design your mind, to shape your mind in a way that would fit the same narrative that you're backing. Right? If the leftists self-define themselves in a way and define even you, and you buy that identity, you're playing that game, and you don't know that you've been fooled, because in that moment you have been stripped of the universal tradition for the way it comprehensively was, and has nothing to do with what you think conservatism, right-wing, or whatever. That are essentially socialistic ideologies, easily, right? Most right ideologies today are socialist. There is no doubt about this. They are completely oriented towards, properly, even from an economical point of view. I'm not even talking about just the political concept. They are, and conservatives do not realize it anymore. It is because the collectivity is dumbing down overall. This is the same also for leftists that, of course, have left us, in brain activity a very long time ago. But not only, we have been largely dumbed down by this phenomenon that naturally occurred because it was easier once we objectively improved our scientific awareness through the through the material advantage that derived, right? And that's why did mass society exist, right? But they were triggered from yes, from the Enlightenment, except the Enlightenment was the product of the Ancien Regime. It was done by people who were actually elite, and that already at the time despised the less intelligent. And because they were objectively less, and as just they are today. The question here is that nobody at that point said, okay, through the advantage that we have acquired materially speaking, that makes life a lot easier, we should keep up with an equal moral development. That branch was abandoned. So science went up, and unfortunately, for many of us altogether, conservatives also began to be hallucinated with the idea that the problem is science, right? And that tells you how morally deprived and empty the same conservatives are at that point, because that would be an obviously universal and traditional accomplishment, right? To have acquired a higher knowledge that allows you to become more powerful. The problem is that to become more powerful, to handle ever more, that was the entire conservative point in history. That's what the entire tradition was based on. No, that thing was just, okay, let's become lazy. And this was foreseen by the same old traditions. It all said that there were different ages, that the world aged, and people became ever less morally capable, and they wouldn't distinguish right from wrong anymore, right? And this explains that general dumbing down. Why, for sure. I mean, there is no such thing like a 20th century philosophical development anymore. Philosophy reached its peak at the end. Philosophy meant properly as this realization of scientific and moral combination. We see just in von Clausewitz as one of the greatest peaks, like with Kant and Hegel and so on. And went down. The 20th century was basically a relativistic disintegration of philosophical knowledge, because science basically was left the palm of it. Analytic philosophy tried at the beginning of the century to create even a philosophy of language that could, in a sense, parallel the mathematical one. And so it fell into this delusion for which, in order to know anything, you should reach essentially a mathematical certainty, which by definition cannot be achieved, because any mathematical certainty is based on concepts that, first of all, are unmeasurable, right? Point, line, and surface embrace the concept of infinite, and by themselves they are approximations that we use to realize, in fact, that there is a truth. We have acknowledged that, mathematically speaking. So it's also very weird to see allegedly scientifically educated people who are into maths and do not understand that this applies to reality entire, including cultures, including morality, including single individuals. And that there is a way to calculate that, and it's not subjective at all. This reveals you the scientific inconsistency of liberal culture, properly the absence of any scientific concreteness of any form, of any kind. And aside from this, I think I lost the point, but of course we lays down and simply began to think that after all, science will fix that, as if you just were sitting there doing nothing and not even understanding that science is made by people, for people, to improve the living conditions of people, which takes an awful amount of work still, because full knowledge, it would be truth, and that we cannot reach, and therefore we're damned to work in order to make things work. But we can do it in an ever more effective way, and if you don't put any effort, you will not reach it. And this is exactly what happened now, right? If you think that you made more effort than your grandparents in leaving, I think you should go back and say, what's wrong with my life? Why have I ruined myself? Why am I, because this is a serious collapse of any moral and scientific quality of any sort. You basically made a fool out of yourself your entire life, and you have, at this point, probably likely nothing. You can fix that, because yes, you can always improve, but still becoming a fully mature, intelligent person requires an awful lot of systemic effort and work, and it does. You can't fix it at 40. right? It's gone. We know that even just psychologically speaking, and just our learning process, for not talking in fact of how we treat children or adolescents in their educational paths, which just um, like chickens in industrial production. I mean, we don't even care to see if they actually understand if they're built in a purposeful way, because at that age, I think great part of the world problems could be fixed if that at that age people were actually provided with an actual moral and scientific teaching. Instead, this doesn't happen. Now, is there a broader path? Like, because the point I've made so far is more or less what you already know, broadly. But the point is, how do you realize that history makes you more conservative, and especially why in this regard? Okay, you said more knowledge equates to less, to more objectivity, simply to greater reason, to greater standards, greater capacity of comparison, and therefore it just forms a hierarchy. But how do you know, right? Why would this happen to you and not to me, or to other people I know? Why did nobody come to this point? Well, as I was saying before, the historical reason is first of all a matter of elite, right? Lacking elite, we lacked the people that could study for a very, very, very long time to figure out, and probably without even too much difficulty, that this was the state of things. Let's say, at the time of Charlemagne, of course, people knew much less about the world, but in a sense, everybody was so fully invested in the difficulties of that world. They were by far larger than our own, at least in the way they manifested. And what it meant for them on a daily basis, that, let's say, everybody was raised with that idea. Let's say it was not even fully rationalized. It was just a matter of leaving the thing, of action, right? Of acting, and realizing through the same experience that certain things happen that way, and that there is no maths to it. It's like speaking of love and pain, and and learning itself. It's something that you must just do, and already at that time it was a specialization of some sort. But the idea that those guys who were in charge of everything, like account, locally, etc., were to be people that provided with an enormous pressure that would have shaped them in a sense that they understood, especially the responsibility of command, if anything, for maintaining public order and making things running smoothly, and having justice, and maintaining the community together to give them a reason to improve further, was self-evident. The same went for knowledge. Knowledge was treasured in ways that we don't even understand today anymore. Knowledge has become irrelevant to us, right? Exactly because it's subjectivized, because everybody is told that it's whatever you feel or believe. Just be yourself, and everything will be right, and then they will be hit by a bus, right? And this is not, let's say, an intelligent way for a human being to live in the first place. And the only way we can afford this is that, again, it's obvious that if you are born in a world where you have money, if you have a house, you have a car, whatever, you can go to school, everything is done for you, and you are not morally backed by somebody that makes you understand what cost this has and where it stems from, which incidentally is a civilizational, multimillenary accomplishment. So if you don't study history, in short, you will not be raised to understand the value of anything. Why is there this all spread of alleged communism, which is just a farce, because none of the communists today that exist are communists by definition. They're just people who hate fundamentally the fact that there are people who are more successful than them, because they realize that they're less capable on an actual level, because nobody told them. So they hate their points of reference. Maybe they hate their family, their context, their culture, whatever, because they realize that there's a better world that nobody told it. It takes an enormous amount of effort to become better in a meaningful way. And therefore, most people simply give up. Also, and especially the ones who feel so dramatically lagging behind, exactly because they're the weaker ones. They're the ones that have not been habituated to that kind of regulation, of order, of discipline, of reason, of lucidity, of clarity, of intelligence. of eloquence. That is the greatest problem. People hate a system just because they don't understand it. This is normal. It's just like with knowledge. You start talking to somebody that something they don't know, they immediately feel like, but I don't know this, so I'm not really interested. You would be interested if you knew that, if you had a topic of conversation. That's why ignorance, are objectively useless, and nobody wants to be with an ignorant. Let's be honest. Who does want to be with an ignorant life? It's, doesn't make any sense, right? You say, but, maybe ignorant can be good people. Like, the question is how, right? For today's standards, how are you going to handle a normal household administration or education or raising children if you don't have some kind of progressed basis? Because at this point, we don't have it anymore. If you don't teach differences between men and women, if you don't understand what, again, the civilizational pattern really was, what the traditional archetypes were, and why they were so, right? The hypostatization of these concepts has brought to the idea of, I don't understand it anymore, therefore they must be wrong. This is like with religion. Why do you think that people today reject religion? Because there are people who know anything, who've studied religion, even just in primary school by some primary school standards, and know how to criticize religion. They don't know anything about religion anymore. And this is not, and never had any catechesis, and never nobody ever taught me religion formally. I taught it to myself, and then I studied it partly at university because I was very interested, and I kept studying it ever since. And of course, I lived in a world that was heavily, informed by Christianity, and so I just, rose up in an environment where, say, my parents, for example, did have a catechesis. They had, a general and sounder understanding, even of some formalities and mechanisms of that dimension, say, aside from the broader cultural, historical, theological one that I studied, for example. But the point is that we have arrived to the moment in which, children born today will easily say, we were even Adam and Eve. So not even seeing what the point of a religion would be. Because if you don't know that, how can you approach that? How can you have an opinion on it? How can you understand the meanings? It takes years and years and years and years, and you have to be a very competent person, even just to read the Bible. As for most of historical sources, it's a myth that the Bible just inspires something. Just as for any reading, you have to make an effort to understand it, right? Unless you want it to become a superstition, which for most Christians also became fundamentally, and that's why also Christianity is being abandoned, because they have set the better example, right? But it's part of the broader moral collapse of this intelligent realization, but it's refused anyway. That's the same reason why there are people today. I think it's Harris, the one who debates with a neuropsychologist or neurobiologist. He just cannot accept, again, guy well versed in science, whatever. I disagree with most of the things he says, but what you understand of these people, that they have never been provided with a broader humanistic education. It would be interesting for these scholars who have been nurtured exclusively in atheistic, leftistic realities, where also the same concept of science was attached to that anti-traditional value from an explicitly ideological point of view since the 1970s, especially in most of the Anglosphere, but also here in continental Europe, we had, as you know, similar things. Do not, how they think in normal universities, in every university actually that I know, in Europe, anywhere, in humanistic faculties, history of religion is even taught. I would like to ask these people, what do you think professors there do? Why do you think they study religion? To debunk it? It means you, in theory, as a scholar, so as a person that would be, aware of things broadly, in life, in the world, etc., you cannot even pose yourself the point of, why would there be people who are so heavily invested in religion, also regardless of their theism and atheism. I know many atheists who study history or religion, and they think it's one of the single most important things to understand the world, and they don't do it because they make leftistic propaganda on it. They make it because they like the historical point of it and the function of it, and they understand it. We have a right to the point in which this great part of this reality is ostracized from properly a cultural point of view, especially in popular culture. If you study religion, you are fundamentally a fanatic and oppressive, and a bit just for studying it, just for knowing it, just for acknowledging that there can be a positive knowledge, not for being a Christian or being a theist or whatever, from the necessity of studying religion as a thing that existed in history. This is what they want to do to you. They, as I said before, they want to strip history of its reality. They would prefer history not to exist. They would prefer to give you this set of notions that just they think they are what should work, and not to make you aware that anything of this ever existed. Many liberals and also many conservatives, in a way, think that religions actually were a problem, were a negative thing, were an obstacle to civilization. These are actual people, lots of them, billions possibly, that mature adults who actually believe these things. So people don't have even have a child understanding of religion as I could have it back in the day, as a very important thing. Just, if anything, because I traveled all over Europe, and churches to me were and still are one of the single most beautiful thing that I can see historically, aside from any spiritual value. And these people are brought to eliminate the idea of it. I even met, this is especially from post-socialist countries, I've met people who basically say, I like all religions, Islam, Buddhism, which is not even a religion technically, but I don't like Christianity. Why? I don't know, but I don't like it. It enforces ideas. I don't like it. I never entered in a church. I know people who reason like this. These people are potentially, I mean, the Hitlerjugend would basically have the same level of a mentality. The lack properly of, it's a sort of dementia. This is an autoimmune mental disease. This is not an opinion. This is not something you can defend. This is not a concept that has any. This is basically a big hole in knowledge that you are terrified to fill because you don't even have the palest idea of what it means. I never had these problems. I, again, was raised in a milieu when I was taught everything. I was taught what theism was, what atheism was, what history was about, and nobody ever remotely said, these things you shouldn't learn because they're bad. Right? Everybody talked to me about communism, about National Socialism. I don't know. As kids in the 90s, I think we were just raised, at least in normal households, just knowing about this. We're watching movies about World War II, talking about it. There were some topics that wouldn't be discussed. This is true. And this is true, as I was saying before, even with the post-socialist example, that of course if you were properly, if you came from families that they had been actively prevented from knowing the existence of other systems, of other economical political systems, or about tradition, or about other elements that escaped, let's say, the few that traditionally could remain in those communities under socialism, it's obvious that you will lack the tools to understand it. But it's exactly the way how they control you, and they controlled you in the past, because they knew perfectly that if you had known anything about that, you could have not been controllable. And generally speaking, it's a very bad idea to pretend to be controlling people's minds. Because moral forces surpass anything else, before any material one. So my experience with history, I must say, however, still took time. So it takes actually a big effort to build up the awareness of the world in its universal and traditional fashion. It's not my ideology. This is the point. It's not something that I decided one day to fall in love with, to parade, to proselytize about, to make propaganda on. This is something that simply, it's like, when the fog, with the mist dissolves itself and you can finally see things, not things that not hallucinations, not mirages, but the actual evidence that you have studied on sources, on anything that makes sense comprehensively. It's a hell of a work. As I was saying, it took a big amount of time. But I don't think that this big amount of time, if we were talking about a decade, and if we give for granted that, yes, I did come from a background that facilitated me in that, but not particularly. I wasn't raised in an intellectual's house at all, right? We were normal people, again, kind of upper middle class, but, educated and whatever, but reading books, whatever, but not making that the sake of our own identity. I was never... my parents never behaved like that. I was never imposed reading per se, right? I was always read. I remember some of the first memories I have, my mother reading me child books. It's obvious. I sit next to her and I would read the lines when she was talking. So I would also adapt my mind to reading, to speaking, and this kind of things. Those are very important things. You realize, and they're very impacting. On children, right? And there is, even there, we should talk about that, because it turns out that most of what happens in your childhood and adolescence eventually is very difficult to say, even if as a lack of something, not as something that goes wrong per se, but it's very difficult to change over time. But at the same time, there is another phase of your life that is, in fact, the one which we of course, we give a lot for granted in terms of what you should have learned in the meanwhile. That's why we have mandatory education. But the idea that when you are 18, 19, you go to university, and that opens something else. It's another time, right? It's like another adolescence starting. We know that because the mental patterns of, say, 10, 12 years old and the ones of 18, 21 years old are very similar in some mechanics, and especially one of learning and existence. So that moment is crucial for you to open yourself towards life. And in a sense, when you're in high school, the idea is that it's as if you were in the conservative phase, because the bases that were given to you allegedly earlier, and then they mostly consolidated over time. University should be at another level that is more challenging, and that is meant, in a sense, yes, to kind of disrupt the type of, say, the mindset that you had before. It's a specific aim. This is not a leftistic thing. It's a bit iconoclastic, but it's obvious, because it's your hormones at that age that make you reason like that. Your prefrontal cortex is not yet solidified until 24, 25. You are loaded in hormones, which means that you are basically going to do stupid things, and you're going to behave and to think stupidly. Because you will be bombarded by an enormous amount of ideas that initially you have no, given properly the construction of them, that you have really no antibody to, right? Unless you're already very educated and you have an idea. But it's very difficult to find like a 17 and 18-year-old that, for how genial and well learned and read they can be, let's say they have got it all, right? They still are almost religiously searching for knowledge and trying to know more. And what happens at university is that you should, in a sense, it's always about consolidating also what you already knew. Of course, what you learn at university shouldn't be different from what you have learned in school, in a sense. It's just the type of level of thinking, right? And at university, you will also be exposed to a lot of ideas that are pernicious. As long as we've seen ideologism is concerned, there is a lot of involvement in those kind of things. Political extremism and violence is typical at that age, right? It's meant to be. And especially for males, because that's also let's be honest about the side of the story. Yes, there is an important difference in these processes also between men and women, and I mostly speak from my perspective, but I do think that kind of aggressiveness that men hold just hormonally for a longer time is more functional to even this kind of understanding, honestly. If I'm a sexist for saying this, let it be, but I firmly believe in it. And there is a reason why I'm a military historian in a sense, and because I do, but this happens among men as well, right? What are the males that go studying gender studies? Are the most lenient? Why are people lenient, generally speaking? That tendentially has to do, but not always, it's not perfectly overlappable, it does have to do with hormones. Being harsh or lenient very often, especially if you're mentally balanced, does have to do with this kind of orientations. But the idea is that, in this sense, the archetype of command, of rule, of order, of discipline, of authority, of charisma is male. Right? So there is a specific reason if communists are kind of more lenient and, tolerant and whatever, because not just they lack that, mentality of order and coherence and orthodoxy, but they do because they are just tendentially more disposed, or they settle themselves down because maybe it was too much of an effort to hold a greater responsibility, to essentially separate their own the latter from themselves and to project it into some abstract reality where somebody should do it and possibly enforce it on others, but you shouldn't do too much in the end to achieve it. And that's also why, generally speaking, communistic forms in history do not work, while authoritarian ones in a broader, we don't have to think about today's examples necessarily that are very statalistic and collectivistic, but think about feudalism and the idea of order, etc. That was enforced also violently, but it was done also because it was aimed at convincing and gaining the understanding of, in fact, of the stronger people that would accept that state of things, right? And that strength is cultivated. This is the point of this video, that you can be more or less oriented towards that by inclination, but that it is something that you have to earn and to achieve. And that's why those words were so harsh, even just in the ways they formed people, because they realized that in order to be effective to cope with the incredibly difficult life of those times, there was no other way but forging men exactly the way that they would have to work in that situation. And that's why we're lacking that. The crisis of masculinity, in a sense, today, it's due to that specifically, because it's obvious that if there is just a few providers for all the other males, what do? They don't find a place, and that's why they think they have no purpose. And that's by increasing their moral strength and competing and fighting and achieving and fighting, of course, within the boundaries of what is profitable for the community, they can achieve more. And this was normal, right? Why does the left attack masculinity? Because they perfectly know that just hormonally speaking, you can orient people towards certain activities that will fuel that or not. And that's why the same goes for physical shape, right? I think it's beautiful to see beautiful men and beautiful women, because in theory that's what you want to be and what you want to have, respectively, right? Aesthetically, this is destroyed. What they want today is not to have much, men who dress like women or vice versa. What they want is to have asexuated individuals. They want to take away the sexual force in the first place by being lazier, out of shape, say depriving you of any resistance to any form of difficulty, so that you can be always worse, even to the point of compromising your physical health, not just your mental one. Of course, the first we see it in the wave of properly of pandemic of mental diseases today, because they are engineered. They are engineered by, I think, easily by gender theory, by this whole critical race theory bullshit. It is specifically designed to crush the individual and telling him, just because you have this basic situation, you cannot improve in any way on it, and it's a problem in the first place. It defines you fully, and not what you do, but how you passively are and should remain like. Right? So this is terrifying. Of course, it's ferocious. And of course, the weaker you are. I mean, a normal person. This is the problem. It's your fault, really. I mean, if you're so stupid to bind those things, you actually deserve to live in that condition. You basically will self-eliminate yourself, because you will be less successful, and so you will basically vanish in the darkness. You won't have children, you will not transmit any traditional values, so you will actually self-eliminate yourself. And this is the problem also the left has, that it needs fresh blood, fresh recruits that they can't get, mostly favoring illegal immigration, so people that actually own some kind of tradition and pride of whatever, but just to repress in order to verify the validity of the experiment until everything is destroyed, locally, abroad, whatever, and so where civilization will collapse altogether. But the point is that they are collapsing. They're the first ones that display weakness and incapacity, and they're basically infected by their own same disease. And that's the interesting aspect of the story as well, because while it is difficult to improve yourself, it's the only option to do anything. So there is really no choice, and that's why history helps, because history, as we were saying, that point of at university, basically presents you with ideas that will surprise you after a few years, because you will realize that some ideas that you matured in your early 20s at some were opposite to what you had traditionally believed. Even as an adolescent or as a child, you already knew, and you were surprisingly aware of them, even without having this kind of academic best put on it. And then in your mid-20s, you start realizing, you know what, you study other things, you start building up more seriously aside from the systemic basis, and you discover, if you go on with that, which most people who study history actually don't, because they just need a degree and they work with something else, and they pretend they are historians. It doesn't work like that. And you realize that in your early 20s you were wrong, that your high school self, or even your primary school self, was kind of more aware and more receptively, in fact, aware of reality than it was your ideologically crazy early 20s yourself. And this is fantastic, because what happens in between is that you are given that mental flexibility that is necessary to include many different ideas. In any sense, you should even poison yourself with strange ideas in your early 20s, so that at some point this process will oblige you to face the incoherence of the coexistence of multiple ideas, that instead where most people stop, especially when you see that liberal thing about diversity, that's where they stop. They stop in the moment in which they were given a bunch of very cheap, unscientific, unfounded narrative to say that the world is diverse, and then closing the book, and how is it diverse, they don't even know, and they can't even judge because they have no idea, and not studying anything else. When you go on, you start making sense of the things you learned and establishing a hierarchy, like this was valid, this was not, and why. Like, this won't happen by an act of arbitrium, like the liberals think that conservatives do, by dogma, or by some unthoughtful deliberation, or some kind of need to do. It is true that there are conservatives that work like that, but those are just the people who believed something and that also stop in kind of to their early 20s university student level, and didn't do anything to build on. This is not just for liberals or conservatives. At least conservatives, however, and this is what we preserve, is a form of knowledge that, if we received, was exactly the one instead that starts being built after that point. That is to say, what you learn, again, in your early 20s at university is what a 16-year-old cadet in a Prussian military academy in the 18th century simply knew perfectly, without ever failing and having all the answer for. And that's how cheap and soft and weak you basically were nurtured in reality, and stopping there. Then the 16-year-old Prussian cadet went on to go to actual war and maybe became a von Clausewitz that explained to you essentially what war is, and that most other people in the war basically have not even the capacity of approaching as a concept, because they're not capable of studying, rather than just not having gone through all the Napoleonic wars battle by battle and not even understanding the meaning of the same, because what's a battle, right? Have you ever asked yourself how it works, etc.? Not the things you see on YouTube, or the hearsayings about the PTSD or whatever. What is an actual battle? What it means to study a battle scientifically speaking, and understanding the moral implications of the same. If the answer is no, why do you pretend, right? What happens later is that if you keep building on knowledge, and especially wanting at that point in your maturity, in your mid-20s, to know what, on the base of your earned structured education, hopefully, not just on wishful thinking, and that's why you need to go through that hell, but it is necessary, right? You will have some questions that you want to answer. You will wonder why certain answers properly haven't been given yet, and so you will find your favorite topic, and you will analyze that. And if you keep studying, of course you should avoid to just being too focused just on that. You should learn other things, you should read other things, you should be interested in the broader phenomena, and that's what the universality really lays in, not just fixating on, say, again, like those people I meet that born in Europe, they fixate on Korean culture, they don't even know primary school history of their own country, and they think that it's cool to, just, of course, those people don't get any form of expertise even about Korean culture, about which they don't understand absolutely anything, but just, say, not being focused on something because you're obsessed with childish, mind games. I'm talking about something that provides you with an actual competence and authority and experience and capacity and charisma, right? So something really big. You want to answer big questions. You want to bite the bigger game. You want to really score the biggest hit, because otherwise what's the point of living, right? Now I realize also the thing that they said in the 90s when we were a kid, this people are obsessed with success. What's wrong with success? I mean, it's not that success is just, a lottery thing for which just idiot people make a bunch of money without deserving that, which is the picture that liberals have fundamentally given you. Most people that are successful are because, generally speaking, they were they had a good background, they knew how to use their means, and they succeeded in that, and they kept capitalizing on it and succeeding again, and in the process also improving the life of other people and civilization, and getting to some better place where we are. So that was the task of the elite. And naturally, the more you handle, the more successful you become, in the sense that, of course, the certainty of success is never there. But let's say if you want to achieve a big success on a big scale, if you don't even try on a small scale, you cannot ever achieve the bigger scale, because you don't even know what it's fundamentally about. So this is a bit what happens with history when there are some specific feelings that are attached to this path that having arrived, say, 10 years later at the beginning of university, and you have gone far beyond, and you have actually done something structural, again, not going around conferences without even participating, or faking your own interests, or sharing Facebook posts from pages about history. That's not being interested in history. That's not making history. It's not being competent in history. That means you're just a moron, right? Okay, we're talking about very precisely competent people, about something that you can concretely sell and work with, because people are interested and they want to know that is crucial, right? Even just as a mean of evaluation. And of course there are exceptions even there, but systemically they are exceptions. They don't emphasize the broader thing. Then you will realize that everything that you have studied starts to make sense, not as a sum of knowledge, but fundamentally as a broader reaction of knowledge, of something that expands exponentially and that starts taking a form. You understand how the substance becomes a form. After all, this is very easy for anybody who studies history. You perfectly know, because it's a shared experience, how few you knew when you were at the beginning. You had a bunch of history topics you were interested in, about others you completely had no idea about. So you had all some gaps to fill. You had some vague, superficial knowledge. You heard of some events, etc. You knew about them, maybe even how to address them, but you didn't know actually what happened. And then gradually you read and you filled gaps and you discovered other topics, and you began to all put this together in something that was really entangled in a way that made sense. You see, the more you know, and the more your brain makes sense of things, if something conflicts, right, your brain has to solve that problem. Will pose yourself questions. You will want to answer those questions. And when you answer those questions, with all the work you've done to sort out, not just you found the question, but also found the question contextualized in the broader picture. And that really means what it means, open-mindedness, right? And so you will be able to evaluate and to judge history. If you are at the point in your historical learning when you say historians shouldn't judge, they should just say what was the perspective of this and that guy extrapolated from anything, and just I want to know the facts, and you have this kind of phraseology in your mind, just know that you know nothing satisfactory about history yet. You just don't even try and approach it. That means that basically you're still paranoidly fixated with some prejudices that you matured at some point because you're too scared or lazy to find out, and you pretend to entrench against some kind of dogmatic mentality that will obscure any judgmental capacities that you actually own, say not as a capacity but as a mode, right? A criticism mode, a sort of passive-aggressive, everybody's equal so I don't have to give answers to anyone, when you actually have serious problems instead with this attitude, and you are wholly loaded with prejudices because you don't know the answers yet, and you pretend as if that you had, and therefore you will completely misjudge the situation. You will offend, you will mislead, you will simply yourself, by the way, first and foremost, until reality will make you crash, and you will be forced to acknowledge the fact that you're simply not good at all. And it's extremely easy to see what doesn't. I mean, the more you go on with your historical knowledge, what is wrong with other people's perspective, so much that you don't need. Also, if you are in the phase in which you need to write a papyrus to answer other people's comment without actually getting to the point, so that you that just means that you want to show off, to say things that have nothing to do with the topic, but that just you need to say out loud to prove that to think that they somehow validate you in the eyes of the other. And that there are an implicit admission of the fact that you don't know the answer, because if you knew the answer, it would be very brief, or at least to the point. Even if it was a comprehensive one, it would essentially say what it would have had to say. Instead, you're doing all that because you know that somewhere there are the answers, but you need to just perspectivize and therefore subjectivize still in order to get to that answer. If you need to do that, you're not there yet either. You're a bit closer, but still very far. Things start really to improve when you realize that no kind of knowledge fundamentally frightens you anymore. When you know that there are things that you don't know, and you know how to say absorb them and say, like creating a wish list of things you want to learn, and that you will go after sooner or later, one after the other, and or even when you want to focus just reasonably on just with some boundaries, because you can't know everything, you will do it by getting ever more in detail on lots of things and not leaving anything just to wishful thinking. Many people think that history is just for example, making guesses, because everything is a hypothesis. This is really true, but in a Clausewitzian sense, meaning that there are good hypotheses and bad hypotheses. It's just like opinions. Everybody has opinions. We all have them. This has nothing to do with whether one is better than the other or not, because two opinions are always like one better and one worse. And the only thing that matters is establishing that, and that requires judgment, right? So many people instead use history as a sort of screen to say, no, look at these random examples in history that I can't even connect and contextualize, but that according to me are sounding like they go against your point. That means you know nothing about history. Because if you know history, you know one history. See, our historical knowledge didn't develop civilizationally like, there is, one history, and then there is another history. They have nothing to do with each other. They're completely different. They don't make sense. Civilizationally, everything that we do makes sense, because if things do not make sense, you cannot even build on them. It's not even, let alone a civilization. And history is really not about that. When you're confused about history, it's because you personally don't know about that. Millions and millions and millions of people wrote an enormous amount of things, and it's extremely unlikely, and it's all entangled with the rest, and all intertwined with one another, and it's extremely unlikely that you come up with something that somebody has not thought. It's typical from the when you write bachelor tests, etc., that you think you found out new things, or that there is this perspective that you can't really understand. You read it after 2 years even, it makes you laugh. Says, what the hell was I thinking at this point? It's so stupid, it doesn't make sense, it's relativistic. And it's always about that. It's relativistic. And this is the point, that there is no such thing like moral absolutism without moral relativism, because that's exactly what moral relativists actually do. They think that they are thinking is actually heavier, more important than it actually is, just because it's their own. So it's actually subjectivistic, relativistic, and deterministic people who sclerotize things in a dogmatic, absolutistic way, because they can't see anything beyond their own opinion. And it's instead people who know a lot of things, and they know them well, and they can dimension them, they can judge them, we can properly build a hierarchy of them, that perfectly know how difficult it is to achieve that, but that also have achieved that, and therefore you cannot fool them. And the reason why they cannot fool them is not because they are dogmatic, it's because you don't see the evidence that they offer, simply because from the other side they ignore that evidence. And so it's simple as that. So history makes you obviously conservative, because it immediately shows you that there is a pattern in history if you have a normal amount of experience. It is true that in the past the ancien regime collapsed because tradition sclerotized to the point that, again, the elite got soft and did the same thing it was doing, the masses are conversely doing today. They began to rely on their beliefs without understanding them anymore, and therefore without being driven by them as they were before. There is a process of modernization and secularization for which those elites lost it, and therefore they didn't have the power that they had in the past compared to the other people. It's not just that the world was becoming more complex, which surely helped complicating things, but it happened slowly after all. It's that those people were lagging behind in terms of the standards that they had once, right? And this happens for everyone. And that's what we have failed to recognize. We have been told that the values that we have now are, an improvement from the ones we have in the past. No. We just had the possibility finally of materially benefiting of the accomplishments of others, so that we could have more to learn something. But this something is not absolutely, so it improved in absolute terms, but in relative terms this something is absolutely not near as what was owned before by the competent elite that were born by knowing what to do exactly and how to see the world, because that was exactly the functional one it did, right? And that's why today the liberal perspective, that of course leans towards the people broadly meant, the proletarian, so the last, right, the least, and that knows less, is so obsessed with this achievement, because if they admitted that this absolute achievement was, however had nothing to do with their own individual quality, they would deny their own quality, and that's something that a weak person, a paranoid person, a complex person doesn't want to do. And of course, they never had any kind of value. Of course, there was a middle class, where we talk about the bourgeoisie, surely was, especially in the age of revolution, the one that had worked a lot and that had somewhat earned that kind of moral force that was able to use also against the elite that had sclerotized, right? But it's always a matter of that acquired power, right? And also that middle class has fundamentally disappeared. Do you know a bourgeoisie today? There's fundamentally not. There's just a sort of, blob of, people that are more or less affluent in a barely decent way, that think that they made it in life because, again, they own, a house and a car, but they don't absolutely understand anything about the world where they live, nor they have, standards, and they continue failing their life, in their relations, and everything, because they don't even see the reason why that happens, right? And in a way, let's say humanity has a way of improving the situation, especially when it's under pressure, and so this opens to other considerations that for today's video are not really necessary. But what I mean is that history shows you how the pattern happens, right? History shows you the fact that there is an order of things, that if a person makes a mistake, chances are that you can explain it because you have seen it before and you can explain the difference. After all, this really has a lot of connections with psychology as well. Like, it's very easy, I think, for a historian to understand humanity better, to understand what's wrong with that, to understand why all the people I meet with problems are people who deny reality, right? In a way or another. All weakness becomes from refusing knowledge, from refusing the idea that knowledge brings with itself, forcefully, that there are standards, that knowledge makes the difference, because otherwise we wouldn't need it. And that's the point of tradition entirely, and the whole thing of the golden age and of the blessed blissfulness, let's say, that we had before. We had to go through harshness and finding solutions to problems for which knowledge was required. If you don't understand that knowledge serves to improve your life and the one of others, what kind of moral standards can you have? So that's why science and morality cannot go without the other. Right, and this is valid both for conservatism and liberals, and albeit in different ways, seem to have both forgotten how the thing really works. So, this idea of also flattering yourself and thinking that it's over, that you got that knowledge, that you are in the group of cool people, of the winners, whatever, or even of the victims, if that makes you acquire more social score, depending if you want to be. The difference in being towards the super-personal, towards the sub-personal, which is factually the difference between conservatism and liberalism. You choose, right? You're just basically humiliating yourself. You're letting slip opportunities to be a better person, and that will have factual consequences, right? Not wanting to hear that a behavior is irresponsible, that not knowing things in history makes you objectively dumb about basically anything, politics, war, society, but even your family, even yourself, right? How can you... I've met people who, I don't know, that they it's incredible what they thought about history, and you said, could this person really live without having this knowledge? How can you even live in realities that where you compromise with essentially with the fact that you perfectly know something went terribly wrong, but you still feel the need of saying, well, but maybe there was something not so wrong about it, as a form of, you know, of counterbalance that can make you feel better about your and these people crash at the end of the day because their lives are already pretty lame, but they convince themselves that no, everything is going well. Yeah, okay, but you're visibly unhealthy and you have problems. No, it's going well. I decide that. Yeah, okay, but you're, you know, not, you know, your health is failing. I don't care. You don't care about me. If you don't understand, you're willing to impose me things. This is the attitude. And it's called, in my opinion, I may be repetitive, but I think that the main indicator of cultural failure is paranoia, right? We know that, even just psychologically speaking, that the countries that were more exposed to dictatorships, that they have, first of all, a wave of actual mental diseases, not the ones that, you know, spoiled kids in the first world invent because they also have their own problems, but they have it because they're just weak slobs, not because they have any actual problem. But the actual mental diseases, the ones that, you know, you have really serious health troubles in your life for, are disproportionately higher in those countries that have been actively preventing people from learning and that just abusing them and ruling on it. And the interesting thing, it doesn't disappear in a generation or not. Doesn't mean like, you know, now the human being goes living in a better place, it works. No, the human being is fucked up in the head. And it will remain so because, you know, if that human being also will have a child, and the child will rise up with a fucked up parent. And the thing will last several generations before it's over, always hoping that the place where they live in the meanwhile hasn't become yet another dictatorship. So there is a very few to kid about this. But I think, again, that paranoia is the main indicator of this, because it's like when, you know, it's the fall from Eden, right? It's the idea that it was a moment of desperation. Yes, but then people, even after the most terrible sins, went to work and to accomplish and to improve. And this somehow was considered by God, that led it to, and saw it as a positive thing. And it can't be, it means that you can't fully save yourself by yourself, I mean. But this means that you can improve, and that this opens to the concept of grace, works, etc. And that's another thing, and we'll have to talk about Christianity and paganism very seriously, because there is something there that even there is a lot of properly Christian phobia, and generally speaking of, you know, sort of revival of paganism without any form even there of actual competence, that is, you know, inventing things that never existed, that you know, paganism was completely beyond in a positive sense, that nobody, including neo-pagans, and especially neo-pagans, actually even suspect what it is. And Christianity also had a crucial role in improving, in a complementary sense, this thing. And this is also another object of discussion that, again, as I was saying in the beginning of the videos, yeah, we are all conservatives, yes, but then, you know, one says something about this and they have 350,000 opinions differing from each other, and so that shows the paranoia and the cultural disorder that I was talking about. That is to say, it's objectively even simple, right? The thing that history provides you with as a form of knowledge is that it's not you see, when you begin, you think who knows what there is to learn, and that's why liberals tend to say, the world is so diverse, equates, I don't know shit about the world because I just see it's different, but I don't know what it means. When you get there, when you actually know what it means, you see that everything actually fits not in a complicated way at all, right? And you would say, you know, the average anti-conservative would say, because that's just narrow-minded. Yeah, a person that studied for decades history and that came to this point and, you know, just improved and was recognized and improved properly in the quality of its scientific production, surely narrowed itself his mind in the process. Maybe it's the other way around. Maybe there is a hierarchy that makes us making sense of things very easily, because after all, things are to be made sense of pretty easily, and that it's just the current culture that has habituated us to accept disorientation and ignorance and a sinister attitude towards existence as the regular paranoid default mode of existence, and even deluded ourselves that it's a positive thing, right? There is so much to do in this life, and it's too short, and this is what you come up with. Again, if you study even just past tradition in all ages, you will see that it's a completely different story in perspective, not because you have to buy those without context what they thought back in the day. You cannot do it if you open a history book for the first time. You will just fail. It's just like all the people who come here who see that I make Indo-European history and they think, this is the right place for me because I'm an alt-writer, right? That's what they think. They don't see the point. They don't understand what I'm teaching. They don't see the logic behind that. They don't see the historical context without that. They don't catch the references. They don't even understand that those very videos are against alt-writers. They just will think that because they are habituated to be paranoidly superstitious and to shift their moral barycenter out of themselves to find somebody that fundamentally commands them. And commanding is good when, again, people have to learn something. And so there is the improvement in that as well. But this improvement is so scarce, as I see systemically, that of course there is an enormous problem at the root. And it's what I witness every day, for which I make these videos. And I think that, hopefully somebody will realize what the whole point is. And yes, I do think that leftism doesn't want people to learn history. Marxism has done its best to erase history, to flatten it to, again, a structuralistic, deterministic, relativistic, subjectivistic, materialistic, deterministic system, devoid of any moral dimension, so that it could control better this whole process. History became socio-economical. History should be political, military, and social. Economical is contained in social. It doesn't have a dignity that is above society, or even less above war or politics, right? But that's what they wanted to do, because they wanted to make you believe that changes happen regardless of you. They want to make you believe that things pass on you, that over you, that it happen in a way that you cannot change. They want to make you think that the person who goes beyond to understand more is just a fool that doesn't understand the complexity of reality. Well, that fool will at least make something about it, and you will not do anything about it. It's like the Clausewitzian theory. Knowing how war is fought doesn't mean that that will give you the certainty of victory, but will give you at least, the possibility of winning in the first place. And maybe not very far from a 50%, and in that case, because war is made in two. And I think that ideologism nowadays, I was talking about it in a video made a couple of days ago, is exactly tending to sclerotize these positions, like not to see the connection that exists between them, that is more important even than them individually, even if the conservative one is obviously superior, because it again pushes towards the super-personal, not towards the sub-personal. But one do not have meaning without the other, because it's about the cosmic clash that will produce the motivation in itself. Instead, what Marxism wants is to make you see things in a way that is personalized, in a way that happens without you being active part of the issue, and therefore not even remotely motivating you in making a difference, and making you discover that you actually have moral powers that can break, in theory, any boundary. And that's what tradition believed, and made things succeeding in a time that had enormous more problems to overcome than today. to deliver us the civilization that we use for us to completely forget about that and not even understanding its reference anymore. So this is really the point, and I promise that I didn't say this in the beginning, but say when I will come back at full regime, I don't know from when, probably from mid-August, maybe just to make one full year pass symbolically, but I count very much on this autumn. Things go well to resume fully the the rhythm and the type of topics also connected to tradition and religion, etc., that make this. We will talk much more in depth about this motivational force and its actual power, and the fact that this thing has been eliminated from education on purpose, both on purpose and because we simply became weak, but the two things are deeply intertwined, because again, the weaker you become, the more actively you will push for this happening, and you will bind those ideologies that suggest you that. So if you have any interest in this thing I'm doing, and as you know, I will keep making history videos, military history videos. Those do not escape. As I was saying in the beginning of the video, those are infinitely producible, let's put it in this way. Support this channel, and as I often say to my subscribers, don't pay me. I've inserted this thing of the, I don't even remember how it's called, where you pay the money, but share the videos. I don't care about the money. Don't worry about me economically. Worry about me. Worry about Schwerpunkt. Worry about this channel. Worry about making other people knowing these things, because these things do really make a difference, and the difference that you can make just by sharing. Just if all my subscribers shared this video today, I would have easily 10 times more subscribers overnight. And this is not happening, and that's the difference between, again, the passivity and the activity, between the material and the moral forces. If you want to break the mold, if you really want this thing to become something, it can happen, and you can do it. We can do it. Right? So I'm here. What about you? Alright, for today I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.